Islamic world. So let's see. We mentioned before that Muslim merchants are going to be controlling trade throughout much of Asia and Africa. And the years we're talking about 80s, 700s through about 1400s, okay? And so they travel through Egypt and Mesopotamia all the way to China, and they go all over the place. And they bring things from the places they traded too. So they're trading other people's goods as well. So, you see silk from China and spices from the Southeast Asia, and they have they get things that they want, like from Africa, they get enslaved people or gold and ivory. And so there's a wide variety of objects, okay? So why are they so successful? Well, first of all, Arabic is going to become the language of business and trade. So they have a very large empire develops, and they spread their common language, and they're able to, communicate with so many different groups of people, and that becomes the language that's used. Also, smartly, the Muslim rulers provided coins, and that's much more convenient, right, than bartering for things. You don't have to carry large things, bring large things, heavy things to trade. It's much easier to trade with coins, right? We've talked about that before, how the value is actually in the metals. Okay, and the other thing is that they develop very detailed records, keeping records of their business dealings and their earnings. And so eventually that's going to become a new industry that we now know as banking. And they get a lot of respect throughout the world as, these skilled merchants and business dealers. And they got very wealthy. And so they're respected for that as well. Okay, and all through that time, they're also spreading their religion and their language also, right? Okay. So, of course, like we've talked about before, as trade increases, so then these big, large cities grow up on these trade routes, right? Just like we've mentioned. So Mecca, of course, Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, these are all some of the major cities at this time period. And they're becoming not only trade centers, but then they also end up becoming centers of education and government and culture. Okay, so what are the cities looking like at this time? Well, in Islamic cities, they were had very narrow streets, and they're packed in close together buildings. The main buildings would be the mosques, right, the places of worship, palaces, right, for the king. And the mosques actually were not just places of worship. They also were courts and centers of learning and schools. Another famous feature in an Islamic city or a Muslim city would be you will see something called a bazaar. Okay, a bazaar is a lineup of stalls or shops where goods were sold, and it's basically like today's mall, right? You could go to lots of different vendors right down the row. They were usually covered in some way because of the heat, try to get some kind of shade. And of course, some other buildings would be like inns for travelers just to eat at or rest. And so that's all great, but the majority of people really didn't live in the cities, right? Most of them probably lived out in the villages, and they were farming. And it's very difficult to farm in this region, as you can imagine, with its dry climate and lack of water. So irrigation was extremely important. Your book mentions exactly what they grew. I'm not going to make you memorize it, but it's kind of what you'd expect: wheat, rice, beans, cucumbers, melons, things that can survive in that kind of harsh kind of conditions. They did plant orchards, so they were able to have almonds and apricots and figs and olives, right? So similar to some things we talked about before. They also grew some flowers for perfume. But most of the time, very similar to what we've talked about before, there are some people who own their own small farms, but most of them actually work for the wealthy. The wealthy buy up the land, and the small farmer has to work for the wealthy landowners, and they have those large estates like we've talked about before. And also, if they didn't use the villagers they also could use enslaved people, because that was also prevalent. Okay. Oh, sorry, that's all the things I just said right here. Okay. Yes, I said everything there. All right. How is society organized? So let's see. As you would not surprised, the wealthy and powerful are at the top. You would have that be like the people in charge of the government, people who own the land, and then of course you could have wealth also from being a merchant. And then in the middle would be the regular workers, right? Farmers, artisans, and then of course the enslaved, who have really no rights, very few rights, I should say. They have a few rights. They did, which is kind of nice, like some rules, like mothers and young children couldn't be separated. So that's something. But otherwise, of course, like everything else, like you'd expect, were for slaves. And same with men and women's roles. Same like we've been talking about. Men are in charge, right? Women, you stay home and take care of the family and the household. Islamic women did have some rights, like you could inherit wealth at least here. You were allowed to own property, things like that. If you were wealthy, you could get some kind of an education, and but it's very similar to what we've talked about in other places. Okay. All right. Muslim contributions. So we're going to talk about a lot of different ways they contributed. First, let's talk about science. One place was called the House of Wisdom, where they were really trying to exchange different ideas. And I don't know if you remember, we talked about the Abbasid caliphs last time. So it was one of those, Mamun, who decided that we needed to have this really, center of learning. And so it's kind of a research center, and they were okay with different cultures, right? Different religions, Muslims, Jews, Christians, all working together. And so there's a lot of translation going on, which is great because the Europeans actually had lost, because of fires and, destruction and things, a lot of the writings from the Greeks. And so it's actually a kind of roundabout way that they end up, these later generations learn about it, is because of the Arabs had translated everything into Arabic. Then later that Arabic can be translated back into Latin, and that's how the Europeans are going to learn about all the famous Greek things. So that's interesting that the Arabs were extremely important to that. All right, so what other contributions? So astronomers, they were correctly describing the eclipses. They proved that the moon does affect the ocean tides. Some of the stars that we have named are back from the Arabs. They made improvements to, I can't remember if we talked about the astrolabe before, but I think we did. And then it's helping sailors to navigate the stars, usually, is what you're using it for. Well, the Arabs used it not as a navigation tool, but as measuring the distance around the Earth. And through those measurements, they were able to confirm that the Earth was round. So that's quite, contribution. Also, there were some experimenting with metals. So the Arabs are considered the first chemists. Al-Razi was a famous scientist who labeled animal, vegetable, mineral. I'm sure you've talked about that in science. So we still label things that way today, even though it's incredibly old. Okay, math contributions. So also the Arabs are given credit for inventing algebra, and interesting, the numerals that we use today, 0 through 9. We talked about this before, right? Actually, Hindu scholars made those up. But it is because the Arabs had contact with the Hindu, and they are the ones who pass it on to the Europeans. So it's known to us as Arabic numerals because we got it from the Arabs, but actually, right, it was the Hindus originally. So it is kind of misnamed, right? But medicine, let's talk about medicine. So doctors at that time had to attend medical school and pass a test just like today to be able to be a doctor. They knew that blood circulates to and from the heart. They were able to diagnose certain diseases. That same guy Al-Razi that we talked about earlier, he even wrote a book identifying the differences so people would know between smallpox and measles. Okay. All right, and then another major contribution of the Arabs was to literature. Okay, so of course the Quran would also be considered, important, but that's a religious work, right? So in this case, we're talking here about other works, non-religious. So the 1001 Nights, you probably have heard of, maybe you don't know. Sometimes it's also called the Arabian Nights, but I know you've heard of Aladdin and seen the Disney version, right? Well, the original was called The 1001 Nights. It's a really cool story if you ever get a chance to read it. To make a long story short, I won't tell you the whole thing. Maybe I can find a video on that. But basically, this woman, to not be killed by the king, every night she tells him a story and entrances him, right? But then she doesn't finish it, right? And so what she does is, every day she finishes the one from before and then she starts another one so that she can't finish it, and then she'll have to finish it the next day. So she keeps extending how long she can live. So it's all these different tales, and Aladdin is one of the famous ones that you've heard of. So it's a really cool story. Another famous contribution is the Rubaiyat, which is a collection of poems or quatrains you've probably heard of before, 4-line poems. That's a Persian thing. And so this poet, Omar Khayyam, he wrote this seriously long poem, and it's supposedly considered one of the finest poems ever. So maybe we'll read a part of it together. But anyway, so that is a famous poetry edition. And then, by the way, he was also a mathematician, philosopher, astronomer. He was a jack of all trades. Okay, and then historian Ibn Khaldun, I think it is. He also was instrumental, talking about, remember we talked about how historians are going through kind of transitions during these times, looking for cause and effect relationships to explain the historical events. And he's considered the first one ever to study how geography and climate shape what we do as humans. So as you've noticed, we talk about that every time. And the reason we do that is because it's been proven that, the geography and the climate make a huge difference on where people settle, how they live, right? It affects them. And so he's one of the first ones to know to do that. All right. And then last but not least, art and architecture. I love Muslim architecture. Okay. So, one of the things you have to know about art and architecture in the Muslim world was that, you remember we talked about idol worship and how in the Muslim world, like, they don't even have a picture of Allah or even Muhammad, right? Because they are sacred and you're not supposed to have any kind of idol worship. Well, they took this to the like extreme, and they thought that doing images, right, making images of any kind of living creature is a form of idol worship. And so when you look at Islamic architecture and art, you will see lots of design, flowers, leaves, stars, really cool writing, but you don't see people or animals, okay? And so it's really interesting. So you'll see a lot of intricate design, but it won't have, the people. So I mentioned to you the other day that so that's the first at the top is a picture of the palace, one of the famous palaces that's really beautiful. That one's at Alhambra, which is in Spain, in Granada, Spain. And there's other famous palaces too. But the second picture I wanted to show you, remember I mentioned to you that mosques have minarets or towers. Now, this is not a mosque, the picture at the bottom, but it does mimic that same kind of look of the mosques with the tall towers. Remember I mentioned that to you the other day, that the announcer, the muezzin, calls people to pray 5 times a day up in the tower. Okay, so anyway, so this second picture is not a mosque, actually. It is a famous building called the Taj Mahal, and it's in India, Agra, India. And remember, if you're feeling like, these are Muslim places, but Spain and India you don't think of as Muslim, remember, right, how big the Islamic Empire was. And so it makes sense that you will see these, examples all over, right? Okay, so the Taj Mahal was actually a tomb built for the Mughal rulers. Remember, we talked about Mughals, not Mongols. Mughal ruler Shah Jahan, who built this huge, beautiful tomb for his wife, and it is marble and has precious stones, and it's on my bucket list to go see it one day. It took them over 20 years to build, and where he was supposed to be laid to rest was going to be right across, and they said, he really, really loved her, and you can tell that by, what a beautiful building he made for her. Anyway, so that is on my list to see someday, and it's extremely famous, and I'm going to be jealous when some of you probably tell me you've seen it. Okay, so a very famous building.